Great.
Okay, so before we start, we need a disclaimer. When I say it's for Kabbalah for beginners, what do I mean? So I mean that you don't have to have previous knowledge, but not that these concepts aren't deep and not that they're not transformative, but they're also for beginners in the sense that they're foundational concepts. So no matter how much you study, you have to go back to these concepts because these are the basics, right? In every field, you get into details. You have this detail, that detail, and you get down to the basic. And the basic concept, these are the basic concepts. And unfortunately, I don't always have the opportunity to go back to the basics because we're always advancing, but every now and then you have to stop and say, okay, what is the foundation of everything? And that's what I'm trying to do in the next 4 weeks. You can come to 1, you can come to 4, no pressure here. But the point here is not that these ideas are not important, but they're fundamental. To the contrary, sometimes the most important points are the ones that not everybody talks about, right? So we want to go back and dig and say, what is at the foundation of everything? Okay, so that's just introduction, another introduction. If you had to describe, we're saying that the Kabbalah, what is the Kabbalah? What does the word Kabbalah mean? So there are, of course, different definitions. Literally, it means that which has been handed down. The Kabbalah is to receive. So it's to receive knowledge, meaning the parts of Judaism that were not necessarily written down. It was just passed on from teacher to student, etc. It was more hidden. It was hidden information. It was passed down as opposed to written. But what does it do? It's basically the mystical side of Judaism. So the Torah talks about a lot of, for example, many things. It talks about law, how to live. It talks about morality. It talks about ethics. It talks about all kinds of things. But then you want to talk about what is the mystical side of Judaism? What does the Torah tell us about the nature of reality and the nature of ourselves? So that would all be included within the concept of what we call Kabbalah. That's a mysticism, that which the eye can't see. There's so much more than the eye can't see, at least according to the Kabbalah. What is this? What is the essence of reality that's not different than what most of the Torah is talking about, which is how to be a good person, how to conduct yourself, how to behave, how to treat your neighbor like yourself, etc. Right? So it's more like the mystical side. So that is an introduction about Kabbalah in general, obviously quick introduction. But now we want to talk about what we're trying to do today. What we're trying to do today is talk about a very basic, fundamental concept of a Kabbalah, and that is called the 10 Sfirot, 10 attributes. We're not going to go through all 10. We're just going to talk about 2. So the idea is we want to talk about what are the two most important energies within the world, within God, within the world, and then within our own relationships. So that's what we're trying to do, trying to show how these concepts, how the concept of the 2 most important emotions plays out within God, within the universe, and within ourselves. So that's the roadmap for today. What do I mean? So I just want to unpack what I'm saying. Let's talk about what is 10 Sfirot. Any Kabbalah class you'll take is going to have 10 Sfirot. What is 10 Sfirot? The word Sfira is a word that just means attributes or dimensions. Literally, it comes from the word, rays of light. The fundamental concept of the Kabbalah is as follows. The idea is as follows. You start from God. God is infinite. Infinite, what does infinite mean? Infinite means, amongst other things, that there is no definition. Think about it. If something is finite, it has a definition. If you could try now, just an exercise for a second, give me a description of infinity. You can't really, because any description is a limitation. It's 1,000,000 miles long. It's not infinite, that's 1,000,000 miles. I say it's so powerful, it's so strong, it's as powerful as the sun. No, that's a limitation, it's not infinite, right? Infinity means if there's no limit, then there's no description. If there's no description, you can't say anything about it. So that's the essence. The essence is God's infinity. So one of the questions that the Kabbalah is interested in is how do you get from the infinity of God to our world? Our world is diversity. So many little atoms, trillions and trillions of cells within every human being, right? So you get into a multiplicity of so many different creations, so many stars, so many planets, so many everything. You have multiplicity. How do you get from the oneness of God to multiplicity? That is a question that the Kabbalah is interested in from a philosophical perspective. And the answer the Kabbalah will give you is that there's a stage. And the stage is first, God, even though he's infinite, God expresses himself in 10 limited ways. That's called the 10 sfirot. And once he expresses himself in 10 ways, now you can take all these 10, mix them in all different ways, and get multiplicity, and get many worlds and many species and many creations and many planets, et cetera, et cetera. But it all comes from the fact that what God expressed himself in 10 ways, those 10 ways could now become energy to many other things. So that's what the sphera is. So sphera is 10, there's 10 ways of God express through which God expresses himself. We can talk about all 10 for 4 weeks, but we don't want to do that. We want to talk about just 2 of them, 2 primary from our perspective, and then we'll talk about how we apply this to our understanding of the universe and really to our relationships. But that's just a little bit about what the sphirot are. What are they? So again, if God is infinite, yes, God is infinite, but then for God to create, there has to be an expression of 10, what we would call 10 attributes, 10 sphirot, and that's the foundation of what we would call the creation. Okay, so far so good? Makes sense? Okay. Now,
can I ask a quick question?
Please.
When we talk about oneness of God and multiplicity within creation, if oneness is the oneness of infinite entity, so isn't it important the connection between the multiplicity, because infinity you cannot define anyway?
Right. When we say one, we say one is not the right word. That's another whole discussion. We won't get into it. It's really singularity, right? Singularity means that there's nothing else. But from God's perspective, there's only infinity. There's no room for anything else. We'll get to that. We'll discuss that a little bit today, what would happen, how God's really presence theoretically should not allow for our presence. We're going to discuss that. So let's hold that question.
Vicky is advanced.
Vicky is the Kabbalist of the group.
Yeah, that's right. She's advanced.
Right.
Does she hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
So let's get to that. So now, what about these 10? We're not going to get into all 10, as I said. That's what we're not doing. What you want to just understand that of the 10, they divide into 3 intellectual attributes, 7 emotional. Okay? One of the important things that we're going to talk about is that the human soul really reflects the 10 attributes. So just like I said, God creates the 10 attributes, but the Bible says that God creates Adam and Eve in the image of God. What does it mean in the image of God? God doesn't have an image. What does it mean? We have a nose, so God has a nose. God has no image. So what does it mean that the human soul, human being, was created in the image of God? That's what the Bible says. So there are different interpretations. The Kabbalistic interpretation is, just like God creates 10 attributes, our soul reflects the 10 attributes of God. So if you say God has 10 attributes, that's true about God, it's also true about your own soul. So that's an important point, how everything we're going to say is going to reflect in the human soul. That's why I keep saying that we're going to talk about what these ideas mean in the theoretical within the universe, but also talk about what they mean in our life. What does one have to do with the other? Because we reflect those 10 attributes, right? Okay, so that's the idea of introduction. So we have 10 we're going to divide into 2, intellectual attributes, emotional attributes. Again, I'm not going to get into this. What I really want to get into is the 2 primary emotions. What are the 2? So we're getting to emotion. What are the 2 primary emotions that you have in your life, or anybody would have? What's the 2 primary emotions? Want to take a guess? One of them, love, happiness, sadness. Very good. Happiness, sadness. These are 2 sides. You said love.
Right.
Said
Love and fear.
I'm sorry, love and fear. Love and fear. Okay. The 2 sides. So you're onto something. I'm going to give you the words that the Kabbalah says, but the word doesn't matter. The name doesn't matter, and I'll try to explain what it means. The words that the Kabbalah uses is Chesed, Gevurah. Don't worry about the words. Literally, it means kindness and strength. Don't worry about that. What it means is the Chesed, and you have sort of the right side and the left side. Kindness and strength. What it means is the right side is love, correct? Happiness is all on the right side. The point here is like this. What is an emotion? Emotion is how I react to something outside of myself, right? I either love something or I hate it. I love the ice cream. I don't like the ice cream. It makes me happy. It makes me sad, right? So it's how I interact with the world around me. So there are all kinds of emotions. We're going to get to 7. Essentially, we start with 7, then we get to many more. We get to 49. But the 2 essential emotions is you have the idea of I'm drawn to something. In other words, I'm flowing outward. I want to connect with you or with the object or with the ice cream. It doesn't really matter. Soul flowing outward is chesed, kindness. Why do we call it kindness? Because it's giving. What is giving? Flowing outward. Love is the same idea. I'm sitting in my house. I want to go to you because I want to connect to you. That's love. So again, what I'm trying to say is it's not even an emotion. It's even the energy beneath the emotion. The desire to flow outward and to connect to someone or something else is, we would call it love, call it kindness, call it happiness, because happiness is the same energy. When I'm happy, I want to interact with others. If you ever saw me when I'm sad, what do I want to do? I want to stay in bed, right? I don't want to see anybody. I don't want to connect to anybody. I want to be alone, right? They tell me, my wife tells me, you're so sad today. Why don't you go out and meet people and you cheer up? Well, I don't want to meet people. I don't want to cheer up. I want to stay sad. I want to stay alone, right? That's the whole idea. I want to be alone. I don't want to flow outward. So the love is the flowing outward. Chesed, kind. So we're going to call chesed, kindness, the desire to flow outward. Love to connect. And then the opposite, Vicky said fear, sadness, even hate. I know hate is a strong word. What does all these words have in common? Come back to myself. Is giving. What does it mean I'm afraid of something? You have 2 kids. When I was a kid, we went to what was I afraid of? My biggest fear was the roller coaster in the amusement park. And I only went on the roller coaster. I was in Canada. We went to camp up in Canada. Laurent, of course. I'm getting out trauma. My first roller coaster was in Laurent. I don't pronounce it like you do. We were up in La Belle, somewhere in northern Quebec. And the only reason why I went on the roller coasters is because of peer pressure, I confess. But I went on them, and they're crazy. I don't know why people go on them, but okay. What am I saying? So what am I saying? I'm saying you have a group of kids all standing, and they're reacting to this roller coaster. Some love it. What does love it mean? They're drawn to it. Some are hate. Some are afraid. What does fear mean? They're saying, get me out of here. They're flowing backward. Or even hate. Hate is I hate that person, so I'm going to run away. I'm going to move back. Or I hate that phenomenon, or I'm afraid. Point here is, the 2 primary emotions is I'm either being drawn to something or drawn away from it, and usually that would mean back to myself. I'm recoiling from an experience. I don't like that, so I go home. I don't mean go home to a geographical spot. I mean go home to within my soul. I don't want to talk to you. That's going back. And that is the root of what we would call, okay, another word you would find it, we'll come full circle. We'll come full circle if you want to think about how this plays out within parenting, but you'll see in a minute it's any relationship. You would call it love or giving or discipline. What does discipline mean? Discipline means you have to make a boundary. You have to say no, right? So love is I want to give you, and discipline means I maybe want to give you, but I have to say no. What does no mean? I'm holding back. I'm not giving. Right? My child wants candy. So I say, yeah, here you have candy. I'll give you all the candy you want. That's flowing. That's easy. But then you have to, and at some point, you say discipline. Discipline would mean I'm not flowing outward. I'm holding back. Now, it doesn't only mean candy. It means you have to earn it. Whatever that means. However, depending on how old your child is, at some point you say you have to earn something, right? What does earn mean? Something. Naturally, I want to give. Naturally, I'm chesed. Naturally, my soul flows outward. But then, at a certain point, there's the idea which says, hold back. Gevurah, strength, go ahead.
Isn't your example, though, more chesed because the boundary is a form of...
Okay, so then you have the idea, which we'll get to maybe in the later weeks, how these emotions are interconnected.
And then what about when you say about, let's say, recoiling, when you're upset, you recoil?
Come back to self, yeah.
But we're calling it gevurah.
Yeah.
Which is actually means strength.
Correct.
So can you?
So
why
I
is-
just address that for a minute. The point for the first disclaimer is that the words don't exactly capture the nuance of this emotion because they're very general. So you can't find chesed, you can call it chesed, which literally means kindness, but it can mean giving, it can mean love. My point is there isn't really a word that captures it. The reason why the Kabbalah will call Gevurah, just to answer your specific question, because if you're a parent, for most people, holding back takes a deeper strength.
Yes.
And the same thing is with God, and that's the subject of what we want to get to in the handout. We may or may not get to read it. We'll read certainly part of it inside, right? To give is easy for most people. To hold back takes discipline, not just disciplining your child. My child thinks when I discipline my child, I don't do it enough, but so I don't know. But I'm just saying, theoretically, your child thinks that when I discipline, now this is true about myself, make a confession. Sometimes I have to discipline my child, I have to say no. And my child, I'm not upset at what they did. I'm upset that now I have to discipline them. Do you know what I mean? I didn't wake up in the morning to discipline you. That's not why I'm here, right? That's not why I came home, right? But sometimes it's difficult. It's painful. It's painful to say no and to make the boundary. And that is something that's painful, takes strength. It's almost always easier to say yes in the short term,
Yes.
right? To say no will take a strength. That's why it's called Gevurah. But again, Gevurah is not. But again, you're right. The word Gevurah, which literally means strength, does not necessarily capture definitely does not capture the nuance of all that this very general emotion includes. But what we need to know is the flow outward. I would call it giving, revelation, etc. Then there's the Gevurah, holding back, restriction, discipline, and that is what we would call strength, holding back. And these are the primary emotions. Like I said, you said sadness. Sadness is the same thing. I don't want to get up. I don't want to go. I don't want to flow outward. Vicky said fear. Fear is also, there's something that does not draw me toward it. It in fact pulls me away from it. I see it. I run back. I run away. That's fear. Discipline is the same thing. I don't want to give to you. I want to hold back. Now, it doesn't mean I'm a bad person. To the contrary, sometimes it's actually the better to discipline, make the person earn it. It's actually a better that's really your point, that what's the motivation for the discipline, right? So we're not really talking about what's right or wrong. It's not that one is good, one's bad. Both are critical. As we will see later, life cannot exist without both of these. And that's true for within God and within ourselves. Okay? So that's the big idea. Now we want to see how the big idea helps us understand a critical part of how the Kabbalah sees the universe, and then we want to get to how that can perhaps help us in our life. Okay, so far so good. Any questions, or we continue? So I have a handout here. I'm going to try to read as little as possible of it, but I want to read a little bit of it just that you get the flavor. But first, I'll give a little bit of an introduction and set it up, so to speak, set up the text, and then we'll share the text and we will see what we can make of it. So the premise of, so put everything I said on hold for a moment. We're sort of opening up a new Kabbalistic idea. The new idea is as follows. This is an idea of the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah will tell you that unlike what meets the eye, unlike what seems natural to us, everything needs a spark of God to exist. In other words, every created being in the world must have a soul, must have a spark of God to make it exist. That's the Kabbalistic doctrine. In other words, creation. The big idea is, the Kabbalah calls it constant creation, right? You have the God. You have God. God is the source of existence. I don't want to get too philosophical of what does God mean, but from this philosophical perspective, God means that which always exists. Then you get to the question of creation. Every creation, let's stay simple. Every creation needs a spark of God to create it. If that spark of God would cease to create this object at this moment, it would cease to exist. That's a Kabbalistic doctrine. The word of God has to be within every creation. Everything has a soul. Some people ask me, does my animal have a soul? According to Kabbalah, not only does your animal have a soul, but your tree has your soul. And the vegetable you ate for breakfast has a soul. And even the stone, the inanimate, has a soul. Everything has a soul. If it wouldn't have a soul, what do you mean it has a soul? It's not alive. It's not dead. Yeah, but it exists. You're saying it's not alive. Yes, but it exists. If it exists, it needs the energy of God to create it. That is the Kabbalistic principle that the Arizal spoke about, the Baal Shem Tov spoke about, everybody speaks about it. Then comes the Tanya, the founding book of Chabad, Rishner Zalman, and he asks a question, and he says, 1 second. In Yiddish is a term, a klutz kasha. Klutz kasha, klutz literally means, you know what a klutz is? Klutz, you know what a klutz?
Klutz. Someone
who's a fool. Literally a klutz means clumsy. Literally a klutz means a trunk of a tree.
Oh,
that's a beam. A trunk of a tree. A tree trunk is a klutz. It became in Yiddish that you say someone's a fool or he's clumsy, he's a klutz. So in Yiddish is a term of klutz kasha. What does a klutz kasha mean? It means, it's very hard to I don't know if we could translate it exactly. It means it's a very simple question that the sophisticated people won't ask it, but usually the simple question, but asked by the simple person, is the best question, because the scholars are thinking about the details. The simple person asks the simple question, and the simple question is in some cases the most important question. And what is the simple question in this context? If this is true, if you need a spark of God to create every single thing every moment, and to the contrary, if that spark of God would depart, it would cease to exist, that creation would cease to exist. So how come we don't see it? How come we don't feel it? Why is it that I feel very comfortable? I don't feel like I have the spark of God creating me every moment. I don't feel like this table would cease to exist if the spark of God departs it. And in other words, the world feels and appears to be very independent. You just told me that this spark of God has to create everything. If this is all true, and it is true, at least according to the Judaism, if this is true, the simple person asks the klutz kasha, the simple question, which is the best question. So how come we don't sense it? How come we sense the world to be, and ourselves, to be completely independent? We don't feel dependent on anything, and we don't feel dependent on God, certainly not, because even, we don't, we're dependent on certain things, we're dependent on food, we're dependent on oxygen, but we certainly don't feel dependent on God. That's the question, right? Again, if there is a spark of God that creates everything, and that's the premise, and if the spark of God would cease to create this specific creation, it would cease to exist, how come we don't feel it? Now, you want a simpler version of the question? Everybody asks, if you're a rabbi, people are going to ask you at some form or another, how come we don't see God anymore? How come we don't have any miracles? How come we don't have the splitting of the sea? Right? In other words, question is, how come the presence of God is concealed? Really, that's essentially the question. And what the Kabbalah is going to tell you is you have to understand that to understand why the universe looks the way it does, you have to look at the doctrine of the Chesed and the Gevurah, the kindness and the holding back. And that is the ability of God to create is flowing outward, is Chesed. God's greatness, he's a giver, he's a creator. And that's an awesome thing because we don't understand how creation happens. Ex nihilo, something from nothing, we don't understand how it happens. But God creates, God gives. But what we don't always think about is God, it's not his only power. He also has the power of discipline. What does discipline mean? To hold back. Hold back means not to be in your face, not to make his presence felt in your consciousness, but he could hold back. And he doesn't have to make himself present. He can give you space. And that's Gevurah. And we're going to read this text inside, but what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to say, what the Kabbalah says is, and this ties back to Catherine's question, why is it called Gevurah? What's a greater miracle? To create, or to create and simultaneously conceal the fact that you're creating? In other words, to have that creation feel independent, give space for the creation in their own psyche, in their own understanding of themselves. So, Rabbi, what the Kabbalah says is Hagibor. There's Hagadol, is the great. This is the big. That's the capacity of Chesed. And then we say in our prayer, we praise God. We say Hagadol. He's great. He's great. He can create. Amazing. We're going to say that's Chesed. That's the ability to create. And then you know what's even greater? Hagibor, the mighty. What is the mighty? God is able to conceal. God is able to hold back, to conceal the expression of his presence to the extent that we feel independent, we don't feel his presence. Because if we feel this, could you imagine if we felt every second that God is what gives us life, and if God's energy departs us, we cease to exist. We're not going to feel like independent beings. We're not going to have free choice. There's no point. We'll feel like the angels feel. The angels feel always completely dependent and connected to God. And there's no point of creation. The whole point of creation is free choice. So for God to allow us to exist, he has to hold back. He has to hide himself. And that, says the Kabbalah, that's the Gibor, that's the mighty. And the mighty is greater than the great. There's the great and mighty. In our prayers, we say Hakel, the God, Hagadol, the great, Hagibor, the mighty, and Norah is awesome. We're not going to get into the awesome. But what we're going to say here is that the fact that he can hold back is a greater miracle. And there are ramifications to this. The ramifications are, for example, where do you sense the presence of God? Right? So some people would say, well, if I was at the splitting of the sea, I would sense the presence of God. Right? What the ramification of this idea is, no, you could learn to sense the presence of God where he is not, where you don't see him. Because what is that? You're seeing not God's creative power, but you're seeing God's disciplinary power, his power to hold back. That's a greater miracle. So you go out of nature, you don't see God. What do you see? His power to conceal. His power to conceal is just as part of him as his power to create, as his power to create a miracle. So if you want to connect to God from the Kabbalistic perspective, you don't have to see revelation. You could see his discipline, you could see his holding back, and that's also him. So this is a transformative idea. In other words, this idea is God is present everywhere, but I don't see him. But you do see him, but I don't see him. No, you see his power to conceal. His power to conceal is the discipline. Now I ask you a question, just going back to the parenting metaphor, and then we'll go into our text, and then we'll try to apply it to other areas of life. Going to the parenting metaphor, the child says, my parent doesn't love me. Why not? Because I asked for a gift, and my mother said I only get the gift if I get a 90 on the test. Discipline is no love. So you say, one second, what you consider discipline is actually a greater expression of love. Yeah, but I don't see it that way, but it doesn't matter. That's the way it is, right? In other words, the fact that the parent is expressing discipline, what does discipline mean? Giving you space that you should operate. You should earn something. It shouldn't only be handed to you, but you should earn it on your own. Giving the child that space is just as an expression of love, is even a greater expression of love than if the child would give it to you. So the parent holding back is actually a great expression of the parent's presence. Parent holding back is a great expression of the parent's presence, and that's the big idea that we're going to get to. So I just want to read we'll read a little, 5 minutes or less. If you have this little booklet, I'm going to put it on the screen here. But if you have this little book, it's not on the first page. It's not on the second. It's going to be. Maybe we'll read the top of the third page, right? I'm counting the cover. The cover is 1, the second is 2, and then the top of the third. I'm just going to read a little bit, and just that you get a feel, make sure I'm telling you the right thing, make sure what I said is written in the book, and then we'll read a little further. Okay, so this is the top of here. Okay, it's starting in the middle of a sentence, but doesn't matter. This action is the life force which flows at every single instant into all things created, from that which proceeds from the mouth of God and his breath, and brings them into existence ex nihilo at every moment. What are we saying? We're saying that there's the word of God that flows into every creation, every moment, and that word of God creates the creations, and if it would cease, the thing would cease to exist. For the fact that they were created during the 6 days of creation is not sufficient for their continued existence. As explained above, they must continuously be recreated. We're not going to get into this whole thing because this is chapter 4. The first 3 chapters make that point that you need constant creation. Okay, I really want to get to this part. So we're going to skip the shaded box, the box, and we're going to go back to the 2 columns, right? You see, right? The 2 columns right here, right? Okay. In the enumeration of the praises of the Holy One, blessed be he. When we praise God and when we pray, this is the daily prayer. It is written, Hagadol, the great. Hagibor, the mighty, and so on. And now we're going to explain these two terms, and we're going to say Hagadol and Hagibor is the Chesed and Gevurah that we have been discussing before. Hagadol, the great, refers to the attribute of Chesed, kindness, and to the spreading forth of the life force into all worlds and created things without end or limit, so that they shall be created ex nihilo and exist through gratuitous kindness. For God maintains all creatures, whether they are worthy of his kindness or not. In other words, what's Hagadol the great? The fact that God is kind. What does it mean he's kind? He creates everybody, no problem, even if they don't deserve it. The attribute of Chesed is called Gedula, greatness, for it derives from the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be he, from himself in all his glory. For God is great, and his greatness is unsearchable, inasmuch as it is infinite. And therefore, he also causes life force and existence, ex nihilo, to issue forth for an unlimited number of worlds and creations, for it is the nature of the benevolent to do good. Okay, now we're going to turn to the top of the page, top of the next page. So that's the first page. First page, what do we read? We read that God is kind, chesed. What does it mean he's kind? He's great because his kindness is great. He can create everything, and he creates everything, and he gives everybody what they need, and it's wonderful, and everybody lives happily ever after. Okay, now we're going to say like this. Now is the big idea. Just like this is an awesome, God's power to create is awesome, and it's unbelievable, and we don't really understand how God can create something from nothing, ex nihilo. Now we're going to say just as great, perhaps, and maybe even greater, is God's ability to conceal his creative power. That we should not feel it. We should not feel that we are dependent on him. And that's what we're going to read in the next page or two. And then we're going to come full circle and talk about how this can help us in our life. So here we go. Behine. Now, so I'm looking at page 4, but I'm just reading the double. In other words, when it's 2 paragraphs. So I'm not reading the lines that go all across. Now, this attribute of Hagadol, the attribute of Chesed that spreads forth his life force into all worlds and as to create them ex nihilo, is exclusively the praise of the Holy One, blessed be he. For no created thing can create a being out of nothing and give it life. Right? This is a concept of ex nihilo, creating something from nothing, which only God can do. There's the famous joke that I always say. I'll say it again. Why not? The joke is like this. Once upon a time, the scientists called God for a science, what do they call those? They do it in school sometimes, science fair. So everybody has to show what they could perform. And the scientists called God and said, let's see what you can do. We'll have a competition. We'll see who could take it view out. And they say, we'll see who could do better. So God says, you go first, tells the scientists. So they say, no problem. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do exactly what God did. What does it say in the Torah? In the Torah, it says, in the Torah, it says that God created man from the earth. So he bent down and created, so he took the earth and formed dust of the earth, and then blew life into the nostrils, into the nostrils, into the nose of the human being. So the scientists say, we're going to do the same thing. So what do? They bend down and they start forming a body from the sand. So God says, no. You go get your own sand. Right? Because the point here is that God creates something from nothing. All science does is we change the form. We take one thing, we take a piece of stick and we make it take a piece of wood and make it into a table, et cetera, et cetera. But what's the point here? The point here is that what we're saying here is that the power to create is only in the domain of God. Nobody else can create ex nihilo something from nothing. Not only can't we do it, we say, it's on the middle of page 4, not only can't we do it, but we say nobody else can understand how it's done. This attribute, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you count the top of paragraphs, it's 5 paragraphs in the top of page 4. This attribute of benevolence, whereby God created ex nihilo, is also beyond the cognition of all creatures and their understanding. Not only can I not create something from nothing, I don't understand how God can do it either. For it is not within the power of the intellect of any creature to comprehend through the faculty of chachma or understand through the faculty of bina this attribute and its ability to create a being out of nothing and vivify it. We don't understand how something could create from nothing and give it life. Why? For creation ex nihilo is a matter which transcends the intellect of all creatures, inasmuch as it stems from the divine attribute of Gedula. Now the Holy One, blessed be he, and his attributes are perfect unity. As the Holy Zohar states, he and his causations, i.e. his attributes, are one. In short, what we're saying is, just like we cannot understand God, we also cannot understand his power of greatness, which is his power to create. Now, here is the key. And just as it is impossible for the mind of any creature to comprehend its creator, so it is impossible for it to comprehend his attributes, for they are one with him. Okay, wonderful. Now, I'm just going to read one more page. We'll turn the page to page 5. And here's the big idea of that's Gedula, that's God's greatness. Now we're going to think about of God's might. What's God's might? God's might is what the Kabbalah would call tzimtzum, the ability to hide and conceal God's presence. So here we go. Okay, here we go. And just as it is impossible for the mind of any creature to apprehend its attribute of Gedula, which is the ability to create a being out of nothing and give it life, as it is written, the world is built by the Creator created through the attribute of kindness. So just like we cannot understand how God creates, exactly so, it is impossible for it to apprehend the divine attribute of Gevurah, which is might or restraint, which is the faculty of tzimtzumim, condensations or contractions, where God holds himself back, restraining the spreading forth of the life force from his attribute of Gedula, preventing it from descending upon and manifesting itself to the creatures, and providing them with life and existence in a revealed manner, but rather with his countenance concealed, i.e. the divine activating force is at work within creation in a concealed manner. And the point here is that, we'll stop with the reading inside, the point here is that this ability of God to hide the flow of his energy is just as powerful as the ability to create. Just as great. Same thing. He can create, that's awesome. And he can hold back, meaning hide his presence. That's just as amazing. That's just as great. And that's something we cannot either understand. Because God in the universe, we have both. We have his expression, his kindness, the fact that he's creating us. But we also have a very important feature of the universe is the fact that he is concealed within the world. In the Hebrew, we spoke about this in the past, but in the Hebrew word for olam, world, comes from the word helem, concealment. What is the world? The world is a place where you don't sense God. How can you not sense God? You just finished telling me that God creates and creates every single existence, and there's a spark of God within everything. So how come we don't see it? How come he's concealed? Well, one is chesed, his ability of giving, his ability of expression, and just as great is his ability to hold back, to conceal, to hide, to restrain himself, not to be in your face. And that is the two ideas, how chesed and gevurah, kindness and discipline, and restraint, how they play out in the entire universe, the way the Kabbalah understands the universe. And then we'll take a question or two, and then in a moment, we'll get back and figure out how knowing this can help us in our life. But the big idea here is that the Chesed and Gevurah, these two attributes, they really color and picture our understanding of the universe. On one hand, God is here, God is present, God creates constantly. On the other hand, it explains why we don't see him, why we don't sense him, why we feel independent. Why do we feel independent? Because he's holding himself back. He's restraining. Why? Because he doesn't love us? No, he's holding himself back, concealing himself to give space for us. Just like the parent who says, I'm not going to give you something. I'm going to give you the room to earn it. Right? I could say, here, you can have it. Or I could say, I'm disciplining, I'm holding back, I'm restraining, I'm saying I'm not going to give unless you deserve, unless you figure it out on your own. So just a simple example. The child comes to the parent and say, okay, could you help me with my math homework? So the easier answer is to say, give them the answer. That's giving. Harder answer is to say, I'm not giving. When you're not giving, it's not because you're not present, it's not because you don't care, it's because you want the child to figure it out on their own, right? So that you're just as present, but to the child, your presence is now concealed because they don't feel like they're getting anything. But in reality, you're giving them space for them to develop. So that is how the idea of Chesed and Gevurah are critical to understanding the universe, the two sides of the universe. On the one hand, the universe and nature is an expression of God because it would not be created without God, and without God continuously creating it. So every time you go outside, you look at the tree, what you're really seeing is a spark of God. On the other hand, that spark of God that's there is not obvious. And the spark of God that's within my own consciousness is not obvious. So is it here, is it not here? The answer is there's two attributes. Next time you pray, there's Hagadol, the great, and Hagibor, the mighty. Hagadol is the power to give, the power to create. Hagibor is the power to hold back, to hide and to conceal the greatness of God. Okay, so that's the next step. We have a few minutes left. We're gonna go to the third step of our journey. But first, Vicky, go ahead.
Thank you. Rabbi Feldman, from the Kabbalah's point of view, maybe it's a little bit outside of the mainstream of the class. From the Kabbalah point of view, because we're talking about continuous creation, was Tzimtzum happened at certain point in time, or the time was created after the Tzimtzum? What does Kabbalah think about? What is Kabbalah's view of that? I mean, I know it's maybe beyond our comprehension, but I just want to.
On the scope of this class, but in general, time is a product of the Tzimtzum. When you have the infinity of God Himself, you're not well. It depends which Tzimtzum. The earliest Tzimtzum, according to the Kabbalah, there are multiple Tzimtzumim. To create the time can only be created after you have the 10 attributes. And the 10 attributes need some degree of Tzimtzum. So it really depends which Tzimtzum you're referring to, but that's already specific. That's already not the basics, that's already details. The big idea is God has the power to conceal. How He expresses that power, you would have to study what they call Seder Hishtalshalut, which is the order of the evolution of the spiritual worlds, which the Kabbalah discusses, which Chassidus explains, but that's already beyond. But the point here is, yes, when you go to within God Himself, there's no time. Time is change. Change is dependent on something limited, depending how you understand time. But you need something that's limited to count, to change. If God doesn't change, if there's no change, there's no time. God Himself doesn't change. If God Himself doesn't change, there's no time. Okay, so far, are we making sense? Okay, fine. How does this help us? How does this help us? So again, the soul of man of the human being is an expression of God. We too have to think about our relationship with other people in the context of how God relates with us. So if God relates to us with the both powers of kindness and discipline, which really means expression and restraint. That's how God creates the world. Otherwise, there would be no relationship, because the point here is, if God would just create us and not hide his presence, then we wouldn't really feel ourselves. We would just feel completely dependent on Him. And we wouldn't feel like we have our own personality. That's not a relationship. So for God to have a relationship with us, what He does is He has both attributes. It's the power to give and the power of restraint. Hold myself back. Don't always express yourself. And what we're trying to say, what the Kabbalah is going to say, is we need this model when we relate to God, but also when we relate to other people. And this is especially true in the Western world, where they overemphasize love, and they don't emphasize enough the restraint, which we're going to call respect. We're going to call it respect, and you'll see why in a moment. And there's a beautiful metaphor of the Zohar. The Zohar says, look, you have a bird. You want a bird to fly, or an airplane. Today you have an airplane, but a bird. The bird has to fly. You want to create something spiritual. You want to defy gravity. So you need two wings. You would never have a bird flying with one wing. It's an impossibility. So what does the Kabbalah say? You want to create a relationship. You want to create an emotion, create something spiritual with somebody else. You cannot have a relationship that has one wing. That one wing would be either love or respect. You need both wings of the Chesed and the Gevurah. You need the giving, the expression, and you need the restraint. And if you don't have both, then ultimately it's like a bird is going to spiral down. It's going to fall out of the sky, because it cannot maintain its flight without both those wings. And the same thing with our relationship with God, but also, just as important, our relationship with other people, according to the Kabbalah, especially the significant relationships, you're going to need the Chesed and the Gevurah, the restraint, the giving expression, we'll call it love, and the restraint, which we'll call respect, holding back. What do I mean? I mean in the most simple form that there's a problem with love. What's the problem with love? So what does love mean? If we want to describe it the way we described it before, I want to flow out, I want to become one with you. What's the problem? The problem is that I want to become one with you. We're not one. So what's going to happen? Eventually, we're going to get friction. Why? Because you like one thing, I like something else. And that's going to cause a great frustration. When I recognized ultimately when the honeymoon is over and I realized we're not one, we're not the same. What I like is not necessarily what you like certainly not at this moment. And now because I love you so much, I want to be one with you. So I want you to love what I want, or to do something together with me, or to see the world the way I do. And that's why love, the danger of love is a lot of times when somebody is very loving, it also becomes overbearing. And love can become into dominance, because love is, I want to become one with you. But if I want to become one with you, then we both have to enjoy this together right now, because don't we all love the same thing? What happens if I love vanilla and you love chocolate? Oh, that's a crisis. Now, of course, that's something small. But when a person realizes that I'm trying to become one with you and you're so different than me, that creates a terrible frustration, because I want to become one with you. And love is about becoming one. And the more I love you, the more it hurts me when you're different than me. When you see something different than me, you see the world different than me, or you respond to a scenario different than I would. So what is the Kabbalah telling you? The Kabbalah is telling you that a relationship, you must have respect. What does respect mean? Respect is understand that the person you want to become one with is different than you, and they're allowed to be different than you. And you have to give them the space, and they have the permission. You have the right to see the world differently. And ultimately, the relationship is built not by becoming one in the sense that denying that the other person is different. To the contrary, you have to have a balance. You are different, you are distinct, but hopefully we can create harmony between these two distinct beings. But ultimately, it's two becoming one. But it's not, you're going to have times when you recognize, respect the other person's right and celebrate the person's right. Not just right, celebrate the person's distinctions. Because look, chances are, if we're in a relationship, that there's some overlap between us. We have love in the sense that we are the same in some ways, but we are different in many ways because we're two distinct people, right? So you need to have both that love, that desire to become one, but you also, for the relationship to last, if you want to have oxygen, it shouldn't suffocate, it should have two wings, it should be able to fly, you have to be able to recognize and respect the Gevurah. Restrain, give the other person the space. Now, people don't like to do that because that means I have to agree with the other person. Doesn't mean that, right? Let's say I think A and you think B. Respect doesn't mean that I have to convince you to agree with me. It also doesn't mean that I have to go along with you. I have to agree with B, right? It means that I have to respect that I am different than you. And therefore, in this situation, this is what would help me. In this situation, but you in the same situation, you need something else. Simple example. When this happens to you, I need to talk. But you may need to have time to relax by yourself. Who's right or wrong? It's not about right or wrong. It's about the respect that we are different and we are allowed to be different just because we want to become one. And in some cases we are one, but we have to also have the other wing, which was respect the difference. And now try to, quote unquote, convert the other person to my perspective, right? Because that would be just love. And just love, just like God, what did God say? God said, look, if I'm going to be in their face, we're not going to have a relationship. It's only going to be about me. If you want two parties to have a relationship, you got to give that person the breathing space. That's the Gevurah, that's the restraint. You have to hold back. And it's true with every relationship. With children, it's also true. You know, the children is, sometimes I want my child to be like me. So what do? I try to superimpose what I want on the child. And also I try to superimpose my way. And I also try to help them to do it because that's the way I would do it. But they have to say, you know, my child's different than me. They learn differently. They do things differently. They don't like the same thing. It's very hard. Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to recognize that your child is different than you? It's so hard because I love them so much. And what is love? Love is the desire to become one. But what is a relationship? Our relationship is the chesed, the desire to become one, together with the gevurah, the desire of restraint. And with children, the older they get, unfortunately, the more you have to restrain. You also have to love, but you also have to restrain. You have to give them space. But so it's true in every relationship. And so what we try to do here today is show how the Kabbalistic concept of there's 10 sfirot, and we're just talking about the two primary ones, because they're the two most important emotional ones. And that is the ability to flow outward, to connect, to give, as opposed to the ability to flow inward, to hold back, not because I don't like the other person. Sometimes I hold back because I don't like you, but sometimes I hold back because I want you to shine. I want you to express your perspective. Both of these are important in the creation of the world, like we read in the Tanya, because otherwise, if God wouldn't express himself, there would be no creation. If God would express himself and not conceal himself, then we wouldn't feel the way we feel today, that we're our own entity. We would feel completely dependent on the energy of God, and we would feel like the angels feel. So how do we feel human? We feel human because we have both aspects. God expresses himself, but also restrains himself. He gives, but he also holds back. He also doesn't make it in our face that we feel dependent on him. And then how does this apply to our relationships? So in every relationship, you have to have the idea with other people, saying, follow the model of God. It worked for him, it will work for us. We have the desire to become one. And in some ways we do become one because we connect in a very deep way. But in the other sense, sometimes we have to respect the fact that the other person is different and they're entitled to be different. And you know something? They're only interesting because they're different. Because if I would marry my clone, I would probably get bored of myself because I'm not that interesting. I mean, a little interesting, not that interesting. After a while, I'd get bored. The point here is you have to respect that they're different and they respond differently to stimuli, and that's okay. And when you recognize it, when you respect, then the love can work as well because you have two wings. And the two wings are the chesed, the giving, the flowing outward, and the gevurah, the restraint, the holding back. So if we were successful today, it was to talk about one idea, Kabbalistic idea. I'm going to try to do this model in the other classes as well. We have a Kabbalistic idea, Chesed, Gevurah, giving and restraint. Show how that is within God, how God creates the universe, that there is God's presence, his flowing outward, his creative power, his giving. But if we just gave, we wouldn't have the universe we know. If he didn't express anything, we wouldn't exist. But if he just expressed and did not hold back, we wouldn't have the universe we know. We wouldn't have the consciousness that we know. So what we have today is because God gives, but he also restrains. He also restrains his presence. He conceals his presence. And that allows us to flourish and us to make decisions and us to have free choice. And in human relationships, it's the same point. You want to become one with the other person, but you also have to respect that they are different. And there's times to be one, and there's times to be different, as in respect the fact that we're going to disagree. And that's okay. And there's nothing wrong. Even though innately, because I love you so much, I don't want you to disagree. But what happens if the disagreement is not a sign of compromise? To the contrary, the disagreement is a sign of respect. And you know something? It takes much more power, going back to the original point of Gevurah, strength. It takes much more strength to respect than to love. To love is easy, because love just means I want to become one with you. I want you to love vanilla ice cream just like I do. Or you know what? I'd rather love chocolate ice cream just like you do. It doesn't matter. There's no conflict. Love is all about one. But to manage the fact, to recognize that we're different, and we could sort of benefit from this difference, that's much more tricky. And that's the balance of having a healthy relationship, of having, I want to become one with someone who's different than me. And they have the right to be different, and yet we want to bridge the difference. We want to harmonize between the two different, distinct human beings. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining in person or online. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Questions, comments, jokes, everybody, anything is welcome. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Joe.